teal WWJD bracelet in the 90s, or as my kids would call it back in the 1900s. Admittedly, I rarely wore the bracelet because the fray-guarded ends would scratch up the inside of my wrist. But back then, a WWJD bracelet was the necessary proof that you were a real Christian. Or at least that was what I believed with my whole heart when I bought it at the merch table in a brightly lit high school gym during a DC Talk concert. And if none of that made any sense to you, bless your heart, perhaps you have been spared some of the pervasive purity culture so many millennials have had to shed. We wore "What would Jesus do" at the edges of our sleeves, as if that were a question with a simple, easy answer. Anytime I have felt the need to truly ask that question, I'm immediately overcome by how perfect Jesus' response would have been, how godlike, and how genuinely impossible. How foolish of me to think that I could ever answer like him. Perhaps WWJD might help me consider, I don't know, what precious items I would grab from my house in a fire, or whether or not to give a blessing bag to a street corner panhandler. But how does it stack up to the ongoing crisis at the border, the epidemic of school shootings, the changing climate? What would Jesus do about that, the overwhelming traumas of our modern moment? What happens when I simply cannot do what Jesus would do because I have run smack dab into the truth that I am simply and thankfully not God? On this Sunday, I realize that when I'm unable to pattern my solution on God, perhaps I can turn to his mother instead, the God-bearer, Mary. What would Mary do? She makes room for God in the world. There is actually a city called Nazareth in Israel today. It is the seat of culture, religion, and commerce for Arabic citizens of Israel. But we're not sure that the Nazareth of today has any relation to the town where Mary lived. If we have the place just right, archaeologists suggest that it may have had a population of less than 500 people when the angel Gabriel announced to Mary that she would bear God into the world. In short, Nazareth was nowhere. And when Mary went with haste from one little hamlet of occupied Palestine to another to visit Elizabeth, this visitation, by all accounts, is the visitation of two nobodies from nowhere in no place who have been told that they will have a role to play in God reclaiming Israel and blessing God's chosen people, a role in right-side-upping the world. And rightly, both women are absolutely overwhelmed by the news. Elizabeth goes into seclusion for 5 months, and Mary runs away from Nazareth. Admittedly, they could have run further. They could have run to the edges of the empire, past the edges, choosing their safety and the safety of their longed-for children. After all, to be a person of note in an occupied country is to choose a difficult life, to court disaster. They could have chosen paths that included no ridicule or shame for their unconventional pregnancies, no knowing glances, no whispered commentary on their lives. They didn't, though. They made space in their lives for what God was doing. Now, we read this story in 2 parts this morning and in reverse order. If you'll notice in Luke's gospel, when we read what we read as our gospel this morning comes first, and then the Magnificat, which we said in place of the psalm. In Luke, these 2 passages are joined by the words, "and Mary said." Though, interestingly, some ancient sources say that it is Elizabeth that sings this song. And after the song, Luke then writes, and Mary remained with her about 3 months and then returned to her home. And I guess that I always envisioned the 3 months of remaining coming after the song. I mean, it's silly, but when I stage this in my head, Mary arrives, Elizabeth greets her, then Mary breaks into song, and then there's a 3-month montage of like growing bellies and household chores and baking bread and general nesting, and then Mary goes on her way. Strange to leave at this exact moment, but still, that's kind of how I envision it. But sometimes I wonder if the montage ought to go before the song. That the young Mary comes to the home of her relative, maybe not an aunt or a cousin, but like an auntie, like family, the family made of friends, the family that we choose. And so Mary comes to her family because she needs an anchor, a buttress. She needs stability in an unstable time. Gosh, don't we all? And Mary stays for 3 months. And when I envision it this way, over these 3 months, the women craft the song together, making space in their day for these words that provide strength for what is to come. Yes, Mary's child alongside Elizabeth's will threaten the proud, topple thrones, send the rich away empty. But there are also promises that speak deeply to their mothers' hearts, that the lowly will be filled, the lowly will be lifted up, and the hungry filled, and God's promises remembered forever. It is like Mary comes to Elizabeth scared and worried about the world as it actually is, and faithful Elizabeth, beloved Elizabeth, shows Mary how to make room for God in her heart, in her body, in her world. Every day we stand face to face with all that is not God. We see homelessness and hunger and war and disaster. We see the pain caused by those who choose vengeance over mercy. We see strong people who use their might for personal gain at the expense of many. And we can ask, what would Mary do? And then we can follow her example. We can make room for Christ in our lives. Now, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself, but remember that the newborn Jesus is laid in a manger because there was no room for him in his family, in the inn or in the guest room or whatever ancient version of the Motel 6 is. And yet, in that place and in that time, shepherds and angels make room for the child, singing praises, bearing witness to his birth, which is both miraculous and entirely down to earth because it still happened in the usual way. Mary makes room in her heart to treasure what the shepherds say and what Anna says and what Simeon says in the temple. Dorothy Day once said, "Christ is always with us, always asking for room in our hearts. But now it is with the voice of our contemporaries that he speaks, with the eyes of store clerks, factory workers, and children that he gazes, with the hand of office workers, slum dwellers, and suburban housewives that he gives. It is with the feet of soldiers and tramps that he walks, and with the heart of anyone in need that he longs for shelter." It is not because these people remind us of Christ, but because they are Christ, asking us to find room for him. So let us make like Mary and make room, friends. Let us volunteer with the Bloomington Severe Winter Emergency Shelter, which makes room for women and other vulnerable people on the coldest nights of the year. Let us give the Beacons Light the Way campaign a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to open a new place of shelter for folks experiencing homelessness, to aid their first months in housing, and to provide for their needs beyond shelter. Let us make room and give thanks for missionary Karen Anderson on her retirement, for the ways Educación Popular en Soledad, founded in the midst of the brutal dictatorship of Pinochet, has made room and promoted healthy outcomes for Chileans in poverty and now refugees in Chile for 42 years. Let us make like Mary and make room by advocating for the passage of the Farm Bill that provides childhood nutrition, the WIC program for women's, infants, and children, and SNAP to benefit more than 42 Americans every year, and through global aid, feeds more than 4 billion people worldwide. In these final days of Advent, beloved, as we prepare for Christmas, for the feast, for the joy, for the giving of gifts, and the giving of ourselves, let us make room. Not figuratively in our hearts only, but bodily and really. Let us make room in our homes, in our community, in our lives, for those who are not just reminders of Jesus, but for those who are his body, his flesh, and his blood. Like Mary, let us make room in the world for the coming Christ.